late October 2003, deputies Mark Reynolds and Tanya Diaz of the Jackson County Sheriff's Department responded to what should have been a routine welfare check in rural Missouri. An elderly farmer named Earl Simmons hadn't been seen at the local feed store or church for over 2 weeks, which was unusual for the normally social 72-year-old widower. The property sat at the end of a half-mile dirt road, surrounded by cornfields already harvested for the season. The officers noted an eerie silence as they approached the 2-story farmhouse that had been in the Simmons family for generations. No dogs barking, no livestock sounds, despite Earl being known for keeping chickens and a few cows. "I've got a bad feeling about this one," Diaz told Reynolds as they parked their patrol car in the gravel driveway. Earl's pickup truck was still parked in its usual spot, and the front porch light had been left on, glowing weakly in the afternoon sun. After knocking and announcing themselves with no response, the deputies decided to enter the property. The smell hit them immediately, that unmistakable odor that every law enforcement officer dreads, but eventually comes to recognize. It was the smell of death, magnified by prolonged decay and the enclosed space. What made this case remarkable, and what has kept it in police training manuals ever since, was the methodical nature of Earl's killer and the scene that awaited the officers inside. In the living room, they found 5 bodies arranged in a semicircle, each seated in dining room chairs that had been deliberately moved into the space. All were dressed in clean clothes, hands folded in their laps, and all had been dead for days, if not longer. Earl Simmons was in the center chair, flanked by 4 individuals who would later be identified as random victims, abducted from surrounding counties over the previous month. 2 men and 2 women, ranging in age from 19 to 64. Each victim had been killed in a different manner, Reynolds would later testify in court. But they were all positioned to be looking at a specific spot on the wall, where the killer had created what I can only describe as an altar. The altar consisted of hundreds of newspaper clippings about unsolved murders dating back to the 1970s, arranged in concentric circles. At the center was a photograph of a family, later identified as Earl's neighbors, from 30 years earlier, the Hendersons, who had been murdered in their home in 1973. That case had never been solved. More disturbing was what the investigation uncovered in Earl's basement. The elderly farmer had maintained what appeared to be a workshop of horrors, surgical tools, restraints, and journals detailing decades of obsession with death and murder. DNA evidence would eventually link Earl to 7 cold cases across 3 states. The truly haunting part, Deputy Diaz later wrote in her memoir, was realizing that this man had been serving pie at church socials and waving to us on patrol for years. He'd even helped organize the county's safety fair the previous summer, all while keeping his victims' belongings as trophies in his attic. The case took an even darker turn when investigators discovered an old Polaroid showing a much younger Earl Simmons standing next to a uniformed police officer from the 1970s, Officer Daniel Henderson, whose family had been murdered in 1973. Notes in Earl's journal revealed a decades-long grudge against Henderson, whom Earl blamed for an earlier arrest. Officer Henderson had never connected the dots between the quiet farmer and his family's killer, even as he investigated his own family's murder. He had died of natural causes in 1999, never knowing that his family's killer had been watching him, interacting with him, and plotting an elaborate final act of vengeance that would only be discovered long after both men were gone. The Simmons case fundamentally changed how rural law enforcement in the region approached welfare checks and seemingly harmless elderly residents. It revealed how a killer could operate in plain sight for decades in a close-knit community, with a patient, calculated methodology that allowed him to avoid suspicion. For deputies Reynolds and Diaz, the farmhouse investigation left psychological scars that time hasn't fully healed. Reynolds left law enforcement 2 years later, while Diaz transferred to an urban department, later stating, "I couldn't drive past cornfields anymore without seeing that semicircle of victims, all facing the wall, like some grotesque audience for a show that had ended decades earlier." The case remains one of the most thoroughly documented examples of long-term, methodical criminal behavior in rural America, taught in FBI training sessions as an example of how killers can embed themselves within communities, hiding behind a facade of normalcy while carefully selecting victims who wouldn't immediately be connected to them. The farmhouse itself was eventually demolished after becoming a macabre tourist attraction. Today, nothing grows on the land where it once stood, a detail that locals attribute to the evil that took place there. But scientists explain, as the result of chemical contamination from decades of photo development chemicals, Earl had improperly disposed of in his yard while documenting his crimes. What made the Simmons case particularly chilling for law enforcement was the realization that had the community not been so close-knit, had someone not noticed Earl's absence and called for a welfare check, his final tableau might have remained undiscovered for much longer, and the connection to decades of unsolved murders might never have been made. For officers responding to seemingly routine calls, the Simmons case remains a sobering reminder that horror can hide behind the most ordinary facades, and that what appears to be a simple welfare check can quickly become the stuff of nightmares. On a frigid February night in 2011, officers David Mitchell and Rebecca Torres of the Greenvale Police Department responded to an unusual 911 call. The dispatcher had received a garbled message from someone claiming to be trapped inside Blackwood State Hospital, a psychiatric facility that had been officially closed since 1997, following budget cuts and allegations of patient mistreatment. The massive Victorian-era building sat on the outskirts of town, surrounded by overgrown grounds and a rusted wrought iron fence. Despite being abandoned for 14 years, Blackwood had never been properly demolished due to historical preservation disputes and contamination concerns. It had become an unofficial landmark for urban explorers and local teenagers looking for thrills. "Usually we just chase kids out of there once or twice a month," Officer Mitchell recalled in his interview with the Criminal Justice Quarterly. "We figured this was another group of teenagers who'd gotten themselves into trouble. Maybe someone had fallen through a rotted floor or gotten locked in somewhere." The officers arrived at 11:42 p.m., their patrol car's headlights illuminating the hospital's boarded-up main entrance. Fresh snow revealed multiple sets of footprints leading into the building through a basement window that had been forced open. More concerning was what appeared to be a blood trail in the snow, easily distinguishable in the glare of their flashlights. Dispatch told us backup was at least 20 minutes out due to a major accident on the highway, Officer Torres later testified. "With the blood visible and a possible injured person inside, we made the decision to enter immediately rather than wait." Armed with flashlights and their service weapons, the officers followed the footprints and blood trail into the hospital's basement level. The air inside was damp and frigid, their breath forming clouds in the beam of their flashlights. Decades of abandonment had left the once sterile corridors filled with debris, broken furniture, moldering patient files, and collapsed ceiling tiles. What made this case stand out in police archives was what the officers discovered as they followed the trail deeper into the building's labyrinthine interior. The blood drops led them to the former surgical wing, where they found evidence of recent occupation. Not just teenagers seeking thrills, but something more organized and disturbing. One of the operating theaters had been cleared of debris and cleaned, Mitchell described. There were battery-powered lamps set up, surgical instruments laid out on trays, and a modern gurney in the center of the room. It looked like someone had set up a makeshift surgical suite. The officers radioed in their findings, documenting the scene with their body cameras, footage that would later become crucial evidence. As they continued searching for the 911 caller, they discovered several rooms that had been converted into living quarters, complete with camping supplies, preserved food, and portable heaters. It was clear someone had been living there for months, possibly years, said Torres. We found journals detailing medical procedures, anatomical diagrams, and lists of names, all written in the same meticulous handwriting. The investigation took a darker turn when they reached the hospital's former morgue in the sub-basement level. The stainless steel refrigeration units, long since disconnected from power, had been repurposed as storage. Inside, the officers discovered preserved human tissue samples, labeled with dates spanning the previous 3 years. Before they could fully process what they were seeing, the officers heard a crash from somewhere deeper in the building, followed by a faint call for help. Following the sound, they arrived at a padded cell in what had once been the hospital's secure ward. Inside was a man in his early 20s, handcuffed to a pipe, showing signs of recent surgical procedures on his abdomen. He was conscious but disoriented, said Mitchell. He told us his name was Eric Keller, a medical student who'd been abducted 3 days earlier while walking to his car after a late study session at the university library. According to Keller's subsequent testimony, he had been approached by a man claiming to be having a medical emergency. When he stopped to help, he was tasered, sedated, and woke up in the abandoned hospital. His abductor had identified himself only as Dr. Fletcher, a name that would soon send shockwaves through the medical community. As the officers were helping Keller, they heard footsteps approaching from the corridor. A figure appeared in the doorway, an elderly man in what appeared to be surgical scrubs stained with blood. In his hand was a scalpel. He was so calm, that's what I remember most, Torres later said. He stood there looking at us like we were interrupting a routine procedure, not like we'd caught him holding a man captive in an abandoned building. The man was Dr. Lawrence Fletcher, 76, a former surgeon who had actually worked at Blackwood Hospital before its closure. Records would later show he had lost his medical license in 1994 following allegations of unnecessary surgeries and experimental procedures on patients without proper consent. When we ordered him to drop the weapon, he just smiled and said he was in the middle of important work that couldn't be interrupted, Mitchell recalled. Then he charged at Officer Torres. In the confrontation that followed, Officer Torres was forced to discharge her weapon, wounding Fletcher in the shoulder. Even as they administered first aid and waited for backup and paramedics to arrive, Fletcher continued to speak calmly about his research and how he was continuing the important work that had been prematurely halted when Blackwood closed. The full investigation that followed uncovered the horrifying truth. Fletcher had essentially never left Blackwood Hospital. When it closed in 1997, he had secretly returned and established living quarters in the administrative wing. Over the years, he had created an increasingly sophisticated setup, stealing equipment from medical facilities across 3 states. The most disturbing aspect was his record keeping, said Detective Sarah Harding, who led the subsequent investigation. We found meticulous journals documenting over 24 victims over 14 years. He saw himself as continuing legitimate research, focusing on trauma response and organ regeneration. He truly believed he was making scientific breakthroughs. Most of Fletcher's victims had been homeless individuals or undocumented persons, people he believed wouldn't be missed. Keller had been a deviation from his pattern, taken out of what Fletcher described in his journals as a need for a subject with medical knowledge who could appreciate the significance of the work. The case revealed severe failures in security and oversight of the abandoned facility. Despite being officially closed, the building had never been properly secured or regularly inspected. Local teenagers interviewed after Fletcher's arrest reported rumors about the hospital ghost, an old man sometimes glimpsed through windows or heard moving through the building's corridors. These sightings had become part of local folklore rather than being reported to authorities. Fletcher was ultimately convicted of multiple counts of kidnapping, illegal imprisonment, assault, and murder. He died in prison in 2016, still believing his research would someday be recognized as groundbreaking. For officers Mitchell and Torres, the Blackwood Hospital case left lasting psychological impacts. Mitchell later became an advocate for better security protocols for abandoned municipal buildings. Torres transferred to a cybercrimes unit, later saying she preferred digital evidence that doesn't bleed or set up surgical theaters in condemned buildings. The Blackwood State Hospital was finally demolished in 2013, but only after every room had been thoroughly searched and documented. Additional human remains were found on the grounds, some dating back to the hospital's operational years. The case is now taught at police academies as an example of how abandoned properties can become sites for extended criminal activity when proper oversight fails, and how initial assumptions about routine calls can sometimes lead officers into situations far more dangerous and disturbing than anticipated. What sticks with me most, Officer Torres said in her final interview about the case, was how a place meant for healing had been twisted into something so monstrous, and how this man had essentially built himself a kingdom in plain sight, with everyone assuming the building was empty all those years. Blackwood Hospital's former site is now a memorial park dedicated to Fletcher's victims. The foundation stones of the original building remain as a reminder of both institutional failures and the persistence of two patrol officers who followed a blood trail into darkness, never expecting to uncover a horror that had been hiding in their community for over a decade. January 8, 2016 began as a routine shift for Sergeant Paul Hendricks and Deputy Allison Ray of the Pinecrest County Sheriff's Department in northern Michigan. The forecast called for heavy snowfall that evening, and they were conducting standard wellness checks on the remote cabins scattered throughout the county's extensive forest territory. The Northwood area of Pinecrest County was known for its isolation, particularly in winter, when some of the unpaved roads became impassable without specialized vehicles. Many of the cabins were seasonal hunting lodges or weekend retreats for people from the city, but a small number housed permanent residents, mostly retirees or individuals who preferred solitude over convenience. Ray and I had done these checks dozens of times, Sergeant Hendricks later recounted to investigators. It was standard procedure during severe weather periods. Most residents appreciated a welfare check and update on road conditions. At 3:47 p.m., as daylight was already fading in the northern winter, the officers received a call from dispatch about a 911 hang-up from a location deep in the Northwood Forest area. The call had come from a satellite phone registered to a Dr. Warren Keyes, a 58-year-old former surgeon who had moved to the area 3 years earlier, following his retirement. The officers were familiar with Keyes, who lived in a modernized cabin approximately 7 miles down Beaver Creek Trail, one of the more remote locations in their jurisdiction. What struck them as unusual was that Keyes rarely made contact with authorities, being entirely self-sufficient and preferring his privacy. A hang-up could mean anything, Deputy Ray noted in her official report. Loss of signal, battery failure, or someone in distress who couldn't complete the call. Given the incoming storm and the isolation of the location, we treated it as high priority. The snowfall had begun by the time they turned onto Beaver Creek Trail, which was already covered with several inches of fresh powder. Their department-issued SUV, equipped with snow chains and emergency gear, moved steadily through the thickening snow. 5 miles down the trail, they encountered something that immediately raised alarms. A black sedan with city plates, stuck in a snowdrift at an odd angle, as if the driver had swerved suddenly before sliding off the road. The car was empty, its doors unlocked, and the interior cold. A quick check of the registration revealed the vehicle belonged to Dr. Thomas Wells, a colleague from the same hospital where Keyes had worked before retirement. What was especially concerning was the state of the vehicle. The windshield was shattered from the inside, and there were smears of what appeared to be blood on the driver's seat and door handle. At this point, we called for backup, Sergeant Hendricks stated. But with the storm intensifying, we knew additional units would be at least an hour away. Given the blood evidence and the conditions, we made the decision to continue to Dr. Keyes' cabin rather than wait. What made this case particularly notable in police archives was the methodical approach of the officers in documenting their progression through increasingly hazardous conditions. Both Hendricks and Ray activated their body cameras and maintained constant radio contact with dispatch as they followed a set of footprints leading from the abandoned vehicle into the dense forest, not in the direction of the road ahead, but perpendicular to it, deeper into the wilderness. The tracks showed someone running, Ray observed. The stride length and depth suggested they were moving quickly, possibly injured based on the periodic blood droplets we observed in the snow. Approximately half a mile from the road, the officers discovered the first body. Dr. Thomas Wells lay face down in the snow, his clothing torn and soaked with blood from multiple stab wounds to his back and neck. The snow around him was disturbed, indicating a violent struggle. The body was still relatively warm, Hendricks reported. Wells hadn't been dead more than an hour or two. The attack had been brutal and seemingly frenzied rather than calculated. Following the ongoing trail of footprints, now a single set leading away from Wells' body, the officers continued deeper into the increasingly dark forest. The snowfall intensified, reducing visibility and threatening to cover the tracks they were following. By the time they reached Keyes' cabin, darkness had fully descended, and the temperature had dropped to well below freezing. The cabin was illuminated from within, smoke rising from the chimney. What struck the officers immediately was the pristine condition of the snow around the cabin, untouched, except for a single trail of footprints leading from the forest to the front door. The contrast was unsettling, Ray later testified. A perfectly maintained property in the middle of nowhere, looking like something from a Christmas card, while we'd just found a man brutally murdered half a mile away. Standard procedure would have been to call for backup before approaching, but with the storm worsening and communications becoming intermittent, the officers decided to proceed. They documented their approach with their body cameras, weapons drawn as they reached the cabin's front porch. The door was partially open, a trail of bloody footprints leading inside. Announcing themselves as law enforcement, the officers entered to find a scene that would later be described in court as methodical madness. The interior of the cabin was meticulously organized and clean, except for the bloody footprints and what appeared to be an improvised medical area in the living room. Surgical instruments were laid out on sterilized cloths, alongside medical textbooks opened to specific pages about neurological procedures. Dr. Warren Keyes sat calmly in an armchair near the fireplace, his clothes changed from whatever he had been wearing earlier, judging by the bloody garments visible in a washing basin nearby. On the coffee table in front of him lay what was later identified as a section of human skull bone. He greeted us like we were expected guests, Hendricks recalled, asked if we'd like coffee, as if there wasn't a dead man in the woods and bloody footprints leading right to his door. When questioned about Wells, Keyes was forthcoming, disturbingly so. According to his statement, captured on the officer's body cameras, Wells had been his colleague at Chicago Memorial Hospital, where both had worked in neurosurgery. Wells had tracked Keyes down to confront him about suspicions that had emerged after his retirement. Specifically, allegations that Keyes had been conducting unauthorized experimental procedures on patients under the guise of standard operations. He spoke about it clinically, Ray noted, said that Wells had threatened to present evidence to the medical board that would posthumously affect Keyes' reputation and potentially lead to criminal charges. They argued in the car on the way to the cabin, and when Wells became physically threatening, Keyes said he neutralized the threat. What made the situation even more disturbing was Keyes' explanation for why he had fled to the forest with Wells pursuing him, rather than the other way around. He claimed he needed to lead him away from the evidence that was stored at his cabin. With Keyes temporarily secured, the officers conducted a search of the property and discovered a hidden room behind a bookcase in the study. Inside was an extensive collection of medical specimens, tissue samples, preserved organs, and most disturbingly, sections of human brain tissue, all meticulously labeled with dates, patient names, and procedure notes. Journal entries found in the room detailed how Keyes had been conducting experimental neurosurgical techniques on unwitting patients for years, harvesting tissue samples to continue his research in private after retirement. Wells had apparently discovered discrepancies in post-operative pathology reports and had begun connecting the dots. The most chilling aspect, Sergeant Hendricks later testified, was how Keyes had transformed his remote forest cabin into a fully functional research laboratory. He had power generators, specialized refrigeration units, and equipment that must have cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. This wasn't impulsive. It was years in the planning. As the officers waited with their suspect for backup to arrive, the storm reached blizzard proportions, effectively cutting them off from immediate assistance. For nearly 7 hours, they maintained watch over a man who alternated between offering them detailed explanations of his groundbreaking research and sitting in contemplative silence, seemingly untroubled by his circumstances. When asked about the 911 call that had brought them to his location, Keyes admitted he had placed it himself after killing Wells. "I realized I needed to control the narrative," he told the officers. "Better to have law enforcement find the situation on my terms than to have Wells' body discovered by hikers in the spring." The case gained national attention, not only for the disturbing nature of the crimes, but also for the exceptional police work under extreme conditions. The body camera footage from that night has since been used in training academies to demonstrate proper procedure in isolated environments with limited backup. Dr. Warren Keyes was eventually convicted of the murder of Dr. Thomas Wells and multiple counts of criminal medical misconduct, assault, and unlawful tissue harvesting from his former patients. He is currently serving multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. For the officers involved, the Northwood Trail incident left lasting impressions. "What stays with me," Deputy Ray said in an interview a year after the events, "is how isolation can transform a person. Keyes was a respected surgeon who saved lives for decades. Then he retreated to the woods and created his own reality, where ethical boundaries didn't exist. The forest didn't make him a monster. It just gave him the privacy to become what he perhaps always was." The cabin was eventually demolished after the investigation concluded, but local residents report that even years later, no one hunts or hikes in that particular section of the Northwood Forest. The trail that leads to where the cabin once stood has been unofficially renamed by locals as Doctor's Path, a place that even experienced woodsmen avoid, especially in the deep cold of winter, when the forest falls silent under snow. Detective Mira Keller had been with the Lakeshore Police Department for 15 years, but the radio call that came through on that muggy July evening in 2019 would alter the trajectory of her career and the small community of Clearwater forever. Possible break-in at 237 Shoreline Drive, the dispatcher reported. Silent alarm triggered at the Whitman property. No response from the security company's callback attempts. Keller acknowledged the call and headed toward Glass Lake, the crown jewel of Clearwater County. The lake was ringed with multi-million-dollar vacation homes, most occupied only during summer months and holidays by wealthy families from the city. The Whitman property was particularly well known, a modernist glass and steel structure featured in architectural magazines, perched on a rocky outcropping with panoramic views of the water. "I'm 10 minutes out," Keller radioed, navigating the winding road that circled the lake. The sun was just beginning to set, casting long shadows across the water. Her partner, Officer James Diaz, a recent transfer from a neighboring county, sat beside her, reviewing property details on the patrol car's computer terminal. "Owners are Richard and Claire Whitman," Diaz noted. "Primary residents in the city. The lake house is their weekend place. Security system shows they haven't used their entry code in 17 days. Keller nodded. Typical summer pattern. They come up for the 4th of July, then head back until Labor Day. As they approached the property, Keller slowed the patrol car and killed the lights. Standard procedure for a potential burglary in progress. No sense announcing their arrival. The Whitman house sat at the end of a long private drive, partially obscured by pine trees. From their vantage point on the road, nothing appeared immediately suspicious. "Let's approach on foot," Keller suggested. "Cover more ground if someone tries to run." They parked 100 yards down the road and proceeded on foot, Diaz taking the perimeter route through the woods, while Keller approached directly up the driveway. Both officers had their weapons holstered but ready, communicating via radio earpieces. The property was eerily quiet as Keller approached the main entrance. No signs of forced entry, no vehicles visible in the driveway or carport. The expansive windows that gave the house its name reflected the darkening sky, making it impossible to see inside from her position. "Perimeter looks secure on the east side," Diaz reported quietly in her earpiece, moving to the lakefront section. Keller acknowledged and continued toward the main entrance, noting the security panel by the door was showing an active system with no visible damage. She was beginning to suspect a false alarm when Diaz's voice came through her earpiece. His tone significantly changed. "Keller, you need to see this. West side, lakefront patio." Making her way around the house, Keller found Diaz standing on the expansive stone patio that overlooked the lake. He was staring at the sliding glass door that led into the house's main living area. "Blood," he said simply, pointing to streaks visible on the glass, handprints and smears that suggested someone had tried to open the door from inside while injured. Keller immediately called for backup and approached the door. Through the glass, the house's interior was visible now, tastefully furnished in minimalist style with an open floor plan. Nothing seemed disturbed except for a trail of blood droplets leading from the door toward the center of the room, where they disappeared behind a kitchen island. "Police, anyone inside?" Keller called out, drawing her weapon. No response. The glass door was locked from the inside. With probable cause established by the blood evidence, Keller made the decision to force entry. Using a tactical baton from her belt, she broke a pane of glass near the handle, reached in, and unlocked the door. The metallic scent of blood hit them immediately as they entered, announcing what they were about to find before they saw it. Behind the kitchen island lay the body of a man in his early 30s, well dressed in expensive casual clothes, now soaked in blood from multiple stab wounds to his chest and abdomen. His eyes were open, fixed in the vacant stare of death. "Check the rest of the house," Keller ordered, kneeling beside the body to check for a pulse she knew wouldn't be there. Diaz moved methodically through the residence, clearing each room. "House is clear," he reported minutes later. "No other victims, no suspects." He paused. "But there's something you should see upstairs." The master bedroom was pristine except for one detail. A framed wedding photograph on the bedside table had been smashed, the glass broken precisely over the face of the woman in the picture. "That's not Richard Whitman," Keller said, looking at the man in the photo. "I've met Richard at community meetings. He's in his 60s. Before they could process this information, the radio crackled with an update from dispatch. The security company had made contact with Claire Whitman, who confirmed that neither she nor her husband was at the lake house. They were both at their city residence. "So who's our victim?" Diaz asked, gesturing toward the floor below where the body lay. The investigation that unfolded over the next 72 hours revealed a complex web of deception that had been playing out at the Glass Lake house for months. The victim was identified as Brandon Taylor, a 34-year-old investment banker, and Claire Whitman's lover. Forensic evidence showed he had been a regular visitor to the lake house when it was supposedly vacant, with DNA evidence placing him there on at least 7 different occasions over the past year. He had his own security code, Keller explained to the investigation team. Mrs. Whitman gave him access without her husband's knowledge. According to the security logs, he would arrive Friday evenings and leave Sunday afternoons, creating the illusion the house was empty while the Whitmans were in the city. But on this particular Friday, Taylor hadn't been alone. A second security code had been used to enter the property just 20 minutes after his arrival, a code belonging to Emma Taylor, Brandon's wife. She discovered the affair, Detective Sergeant Harrison concluded as the team reviewed the evidence, followed him to the lake house and confronted him. The confrontation had turned deadly. Kitchen knives from the property matched the wounds on Brandon's body. High-end security cameras installed throughout the house had captured the entire incident, from Emma's arrival to the fatal stabbing, to her methodical cleaning of the murder weapon and her exit through the front door. The only reason the alarm had eventually triggered was a motion sensor activated when Brandon, not yet dead, had tried to crawl toward the patio door after Emma left. "Cold as ice," Diaz remarked as they watched the security footage. "Stabbed him 11 times, washed the knife, put it back in the knife block, and walked out the front door like she was leaving a dinner party." Emma Taylor was arrested at her home in the city the following morning. What made the case particularly notable in police annals was her complete lack of attempt to hide her actions once confronted with the evidence. "Of course I killed him," she stated in her initial interview, documented by Detective Keller. "He wasn't just sleeping with Claire Whitman. There were others. He'd been gaslighting me for years, telling me I was paranoid, that I needed psychiatric help. Then I found the photos on his cloud account, Brandon with different women in different luxury properties. He was using these affairs to climb the corporate ladder, sleeping with executives' wives for business advantages." The Whitman Lake House had been just one of several properties Brandon Taylor had access to, each belonging to someone who could advance his career, each used for assignations with their wives or partners. The broken photograph in the bedroom had been Emma's final act before leaving, a message to Claire Whitman that she wasn't special, just another stepping stone in Brandon's calculated rise. She planned it meticulously, Keller testified later at the trial, tracked his phone's location, followed him to the lake house, confronted him with evidence of multiple affairs, and when he laughed at her, as confirmed by the security audio, she took a knife from the kitchen block and attacked him. What complicated the case was the subsequent investigation into Brandon Taylor's background. which revealed a pattern of psychological abuse and manipulation extending beyond his marriage. Former colleagues and previous romantic partners came forward with accounts of blackmail, coercion, and elaborate psychological games. Digital forensics uncovered multiple instances where he had secretly recorded intimate encounters, later using them as leverage. The trial became a media sensation, with public opinion largely sympathizing with Emma, despite the brutality of the murder. Her defense team built a case around temporary insanity, triggered by years of psychological torture. Prosecutors argued for premeditation, pointing to the calculated way she had tracked her husband and confronted him in an isolated location. In the end, Emma Taylor was convicted of second-degree murder with extenuating circumstances. She received a 15-year sentence with eligibility for parole after 7 years, a decision that sparked debate about justice, revenge, and the invisible wounds of psychological abuse. For Detective Keller, the case represented something uniquely disturbing. "What stays with me isn't just the murder," she noted in a presentation to new officers years later. "It's how that beautiful glass house on the lake became a stage for so many deceptions. The Whitmans' marriage, Taylor's corporate climbing, Emma's seemingly perfect life. All of it was as transparent and fragile as the glass walls, ready to shatter with the right amount of pressure." The Glass Lake house remained empty for years afterward. The Whitmans divorced shortly after the trial, with Richard Whitman eventually selling the property at a significant loss. Local real estate agents reported that despite price reductions, potential buyers would back out after learning about the property's history. In 2022, the house was finally purchased by a developer who demolished the structure, citing irreparable reputation damage to the property. A new home was constructed on the site, with traditional wood and stone replacing the signature glass walls that had once offered views into a perfect life that never really existed. Officer Diaz, who eventually rose to detective rank himself, summed up the case in the department's training materials. "The Glass Lake house teaches us that transparency works both ways. The same windows that showcase wealth and success also expose the darkness within. As investigators, we need to look beyond the pristine surfaces to find the truth, which is rarely as clean and clear as it appears." The lake's waters continue to reflect the mansions along its shore, each one a potential repository of secrets beneath its manicured exterior. For the officers of Lakeshore Police Department, a call to any lakefront property now comes with an unspoken reminder from the Glass Lake case that the most dangerous elements aren't always the obvious intruders, but the familiar faces who already have the security codes. Highway Patrol Officer Connor Walsh had spent 7 years cruising the long stretches of Interstate 17, a desolate ribbon of asphalt cutting through the desert. The midnight shift was always the loneliest, with only occasional long-haul truckers and the rare overnight traveler breaking the monotony of headlights stretching into darkness. October 12, 2018 began as another ordinary shift. Walsh had just refilled his thermos at the truck stop near exit 233 when the call came through his radio. A motorist had reported a vehicle with hazard lights blinking near mile marker 247, apparently abandoned. "Copy that," Walsh responded, pulling back onto the highway, heading to mile marker 247 to investigate. The stretch of I-17 between markers 240 and 250 had earned a dubious reputation among the highway patrol officers. Remote and with poor cell reception, it was a notorious blind spot in their coverage area. Spotty radio communication meant officers often had to handle situations alone until backup could arrive from the nearest station, 40 minutes away. Approaching the vehicle now, Walsh radioed at 1:17 a.m., slowing his patrol car as his headlights illuminated an older model sedan parked on the shoulder. The hazard lights blinked steadily in the darkness, their amber glow casting rhythmic pulses across the scrub brush beside the highway. Following protocol, Walsh positioned his patrol car 20 feet behind the sedan, angling it slightly toward the highway to create a safety corridor. He called in the license plate number and waited for dispatch to run it through the system while surveying the scene. The vehicle appeared undamaged. No skid marks suggested a sudden stop or mechanical failure. The driver's side door was closed but unlocked, and a quick sweep of his flashlight through the windows revealed no occupants. Vehicle registered to a Patricia Malone, 43, from Tucson. Dispatch reported. No outstanding warrants. Registration current. Walsh approached cautiously, noting the engine was cold. The car had been parked for hours. Inside, a purse sat on the passenger seat, along with a cell phone and a half-empty bottle of water. A jacket was draped over the back seat, suggesting the driver hadn't planned to be away from the vehicle for long. Dispatch, I've got an abandoned vehicle with personal belongings still inside, Walsh reported. No signs of the driver in the immediate vicinity, requesting backup to assist in a search of the surrounding area. While waiting for backup, Walsh began documenting the scene. He photographed the vehicle's position, the interior, and noted a detail that immediately struck him as odd. The keys were still in the ignition. Few people would leave keys in an unattended vehicle on a remote highway. His flashlight beam caught another anomaly: scuff marks in the dirt leading from the driver's side toward the desert. They didn't appear to be footprints exactly, but rather as if something had been dragged away from the road. Following procedure for a potential missing person, Walsh began tracking the marks into the desert, keeping his patrol car in sight. About 30 yards from the highway, the marks disappeared among the rocky terrain. He was about to return to his vehicle when his flashlight illuminated something reflective: a woman's wristwatch lying in the dirt, its clasp broken. Dispatch, I've located what appears to be a personal item belonging to the driver approximately 30 yards from the vehicle, Walsh reported. The circumstances are suspicious. I'm going to continue searching the immediate area. The backup Walsh had requested radioed that they were still 25 minutes out. Making a judgment call, he decided to expand his search perimeter. Moving in a widening spiral from where he'd found the watch. Approximately 50 yards from the highway, partially concealed behind a large rock formation, Walsh discovered a disturbing scene that would later become central to one of the most significant investigations in the region's history. A freshly dug shallow pit, approximately 6 feet long, was evident in the desert soil. Beside it, a folding shovel and work gloves had been discarded hastily. Dispatch, I need immediate backup and a forensic team at my location, Walsh radioed, his voice tense. I've found what appears to be a recently prepared gravesite. Walsh secured the perimeter as best he could as a solo officer, placing evidence markers and taking photographs. When backup finally arrived, a wider search was organized. Patricia Malone was nowhere to be found, but investigators discovered something even more disturbing: similar disturbances in the soil at multiple locations within a half-mile radius. The investigation that unfolded over the following weeks revealed a pattern of disappearances along this stretch of I-17, dating back over 6 years. At least 7 vehicles had been reported abandoned near mile marker 247, with drivers never found. Most cases had been classified as voluntary disappearances after investigations failed to produce solid leads. What made the case break open was what happened 2 nights after Walsh's discovery. During routine patrol of the same area, officers spotted a pickup truck parked suspiciously close to where the sedan had been found. When they approached, a man fled into the desert. After a brief pursuit, they apprehended Raymond Keeler, a 52-year-old long-haul truck driver, with routes regularly taking him along I-17. A search of Keeler's truck revealed a hidden compartment containing personal effects belonging to multiple missing persons, including Patricia Malone's driver's license. GPS records from his trucking company would later confirm his presence in the area during the time frames of several disappearances. The methodical preparation of the case by Detective Sarah Linden, who took over from the initial patrol response, revealed Keeler's calculated approach. He would identify potential victims at rest stops and truck stops along his route, then follow them until they reached the remote stretch of highway with poor cellular reception. Using a powerful spotlight mounted to his truck, he would signal drivers as if there were an emergency, convincing them to pull over. The lack of traffic at night and the absence of witnesses made it the perfect hunting ground, Detective Linden explained in her case summary. Once victims stopped, Keeler would approach as a good Samaritan, then overpower them and take them into the desert. The prepared grave sites suggest each attack was carefully premeditated. Forensic teams eventually located the remains of 5 victims buried in shallow graves within 2 miles of mile marker 247. Patricia Malone, the driver of the sedan that had triggered Walsh's initial investigation, was found alive 3 days after Walsh discovered the abandoned car. Keeler had kept her captive in a concealed bunker built into an abandoned mine shaft, approximately half a mile from the highway. I heard the patrol cars that night, Malone testified during the trial. He panicked when the officers arrived at my car and left to move it, planning to return for me later. That's when Officer Walsh found the grave he'd prepared. What particularly disturbed investigators was Keeler's meticulous record-keeping. A journal found in his home detailed every victim, with dates, locations, and disturbing personal observations. He had created a methodical system for selecting victims and disposing of evidence, exploiting the isolation of the highway and the jurisdictional complexities that had previously hampered investigations. The highway became his weapon, Prosecutor James Martinez told the jury during the trial. He weaponized the vulnerability of travelers, the isolation of the desert, and the limitations of rural law enforcement resources. For Officer Walsh, the case represented both a career-defining moment and a haunting reminder of how easily predators can exploit the vast, empty spaces of America's highway system. I drive past mile marker 247 every shift, Walsh noted during an interview for the Police Academy training video that later incorporated the case. And every time, I think about how many cars I've seen pulled over through the years, how many people I've asked if they needed assistance, how many of those routine stops might have been life or death moments without my knowledge. Raymond Keeler was convicted on multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, and attempted murder. He received consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. The investigation led to the reopening of over 24 similar cases across 3 states where Keeler had regularly traveled. In response to the case, the Highway Patrol installed emergency call boxes at 5-mile intervals along the remote stretch of I-17, ensuring that even without cell service, motorists could summon help. They also implemented a Safe Highway initiative with increased patrols and surveillance cameras at key locations. For veteran officers, the case serves as a reminder of how routine calls, like an abandoned vehicle with hazard lights flashing, can unravel into something far more sinister. The training program developed from the case emphasizes the importance of thoroughness, even in seemingly mundane situations. The difference between Patricia Malone being found alive and becoming another victim buried in the desert was one officer's decision to look beyond the obvious and follow a faint trail into the darkness, noted the training manual developed after the case. Mile marker 247 has since been unofficially renamed among the highway patrol officers as Walsh's Marker, a silent testament to how a routine call on a quiet night shift evolved into one of the region's most significant criminal investigations, and how the vast, empty highways that connect America can sometimes hide the darkest of secrets beneath their seemingly mundane surfaces. Today, a small roadside memorial stands near mile marker 247, placed there by families of the victims. It bears no names, only a simple message: they were not forgotten. Officer Walsh makes a point to stop there during his patrol, a brief moment of remembrance for those who disappeared into the desert night, and for the one survivor whose life was saved by a police officer's diligence on an otherwise ordinary midnight shift. The Camden House stood at the end of Willow Street for over a century, its Victorian architecture once the pride of Millfield, a small town in western Pennsylvania. By 2014, the once grand mansion had fallen into severe disrepair, its last legitimate owner having abandoned it in the late 1990s following a foreclosure. The property had become a shadowy fixture in local lore, with teenagers daring each other to spend nights within its decaying walls, and neighbors complaining about occasional strange sounds and lights. For Officers Lisa Ramsey and Derek Collins of the Millfield Police Department, calls to 435 Willow Street, the Camden House, had become almost routine. Usually they'd arrive to find nothing more than evidence of trespassers, beer cans, graffiti, or the occasional homeless person seeking shelter. They'd document the intrusion, secure any new openings in the boarded-up windows or doors, and file another report recommending the city take action to demolish the hazardous structure. On the night of November 17, 2014, dispatch received a call that initially seemed no different from the dozens that had preceded it. 911, what's your emergency? There's someone screaming in the old Camden place, reported Mrs. Eleanor Foster, an elderly resident who lived across the street. Not like kids fooling around, real screaming, like someone's hurt bad. Officers Ramsey and Collins were dispatched to investigate what they assumed would be another false alarm. The Camden House had generated so many calls over the years that responding officers had developed a certain cynicism about reports concerning the property. Probably just kids watching horror movies on their phones, Collins remarked as they pulled up to the curb at 10:37 p.m. Or maybe those paranormal investigation amateurs are back. The house loomed in the darkness, its silhouette jagged where portions of the roof had collapsed inward. Dead vines clung to the facade like skeletal fingers, and most windows were either broken or covered with weathered plywood. The front yard had long since surrendered to weeds and neglect. Standard procedure dictated that officers approach with caution, but without lights or sirens, to avoid alerting potential trespassers. As they made their way up the cracked walkway, Officer Ramsey noticed something unusual: fresh tire tracks in the muddy side yard, leading toward the back of the property. Someone's been here recently, she noted, shining her flashlight on the deep treads. Heavy vehicle, probably an SUV or truck. The front door, which had been secured with a heavy padlock during their last visit 3 weeks earlier, now hung partially open. The lock was nowhere to be seen. Collins radioed their position and the signs of recent entry before they proceeded inside, weapons drawn as a precaution. The foyer of the Camden House retained hints of its former grandeur, despite decades of neglect. A sweeping staircase with broken balusters led to the second floor, and ornate crown molding, now crumbling with water damage, framed the high ceilings. The officers' flashlight beams cut through the darkness, revealing dust particles floating in the air and the scattered debris of squatters and vandals. "MPD, anyone here?" Collins called out, his voice echoing through the empty rooms. No response came, but both officers noted an unusual silence. No scurrying of the rodents that typically inhabited abandoned structures. No creaking of the house settling. They proceeded methodically through the first floor, finding nothing beyond the usual signs of trespassing and decay. It wasn't until they reached the kitchen at the rear of the house that they discovered the first concrete evidence that Mrs. Foster's call had merit. The kitchen door leading to the backyard had been recently reinforced with new hinges and a heavy-duty lock, completely incongruous with the deterioration surrounding it. More alarming was the smear of what appeared to be blood on the doorframe. "This is recent," Ramsey observed, touching the substance carefully with a gloved finger. "Still tacky." Before they could investigate further, they heard it, a faint thumping sound coming from somewhere below them. The officers exchanged glances, immediately recognizing that the house had a feature not commonly found in the area: a full basement. The basement door, located in a narrow hallway off the kitchen, had also been upgraded with a new steel door and commercial-grade lock. This time, however, the lock had been broken, not by force, but with a key that still protruded from the mechanism. "Someone left in a hurry," Collins remarked, carefully turning the key and opening the door. The smell that greeted them was immediate and unmistakable: the metallic scent of blood mixed with bodily waste and the chemical tang of cleaning products. "Dispatch, this is Officer Collins. We're going to need backup at 435 Willow. Possible crime scene, potentially with victims still on premises." The wooden stairs leading into the darkness creaked ominously as the officers descended, flashlights and weapons trained ahead. The basement of the Camden house had been transformed in ways that stunned even these veteran officers. What had once been a simple cellar had been converted into what could only be described as a makeshift medical facility, or more accurately, a crude surgical space. Plastic sheeting hung from the ceiling, dividing the area into sections. Battery-powered LED lights were mounted on the stone walls, though they were currently off. A generator sat in the corner, silent but recently used, judging by the fuel gauge. Most disturbing was the centerpiece of the room, a heavy stainless steel table, the kind found in morgues and medical examiner facilities, complete with drainage channels and restraints. Beside it stood a rolling tray of surgical instruments, some visibly blood-stained, despite attempts to clean them. "Jesus Christ," Ramsey whispered, her flashlight beam revealing dark stains on the concrete floor beneath the table. The thumping sound they'd heard earlier grew more insistent. Following it to the far wall, the officers discovered a door leading to what had originally been a coal room. It too had been retrofitted with a new lock, this one secured with a simple padlock. "MPD, is someone in there?" Collins called out. The response was a muffled cry, indistinct but unmistakably human. Collins used the butt of his flashlight to break the padlock, revealing a sight that would haunt both officers for years to come. 3 people, 2 women and a man, were huddled in the small space, bound with zip ties and gagged. All showed signs of recent surgical procedures, bandages on their abdomens, bruising, and medical tape. One woman was unconscious, her breathing shallow, while the others looked at the officers with expressions of desperate relief. "Dispatch, we need immediate medical assistance," Ramsey radioed, her voice tense. "Multiple victims located, showing signs of medical trauma. And get Detective Ward out here now." As the officers provided first aid and waited for backup, the 2 conscious victims revealed fragments of a horror that would eventually unravel a criminal enterprise spanning 3 states. The victims had been abducted from various locations: bus stations, truck stops, and in one case, a homeless encampment. They had been transported to the Camden house, where they were sedated and subjected to surgical procedures by someone the captors referred to only as the doctor. The man, identified later as Kevin Reese, had been held the longest, nearly 2 weeks, and provided the most coherent account. They were taking parts, he told Detective Ward during his subsequent hospital interview. Kidneys, mostly. The doctor would come in wearing these expensive clothes, change into scrubs, do the surgeries, and then they'd move us to the coal room to recover. If you survived, they'd eventually dump you somewhere far away. If not, he didn't need to finish the thought. The investigation that followed revealed that the Camden house had been used for at least 8 months as an illegal organ harvesting site. The isolated location, the town's limited police resources, and the house's reputation as a nuisance property had made it an ideal base of operations. Forensic evidence recovered from the basement led investigators to identify at least 12 previous victims, 3 of whom had not survived the procedures. The surgical suite contained sophisticated medical equipment stolen from hospitals in 3 different states, and the generator had been modified to run silently, explaining why neighbors had never noticed its operation. The breakthrough in identifying the perpetrators came from an unexpected source. The Camden house, despite its deterioration, had been equipped with a security system by its last legitimate owner, a system that included cameras that had never been removed. The criminals had disabled the visible components, but had missed a backup recording unit hidden in the attic crawl space, installed by a paranoid former owner concerned about break-ins. The footage retrieved from this system led to the identification of 4 individuals involved in the operation. 2 former paramedics who handled the abductions and post-operative care, a surgical technician who prepared the equipment, and most shockingly, a once respected transplant surgeon who had lost his license 5 years earlier following malpractice allegations. These individuals had been supplying organs to a black market network catering to wealthy clients who either couldn't wait for legal transplants or had been rejected by the legitimate medical system due to age, lifestyle factors, or other contraindications. The case broke open the larger investigation into organ trafficking networks operating throughout the northeastern United States. The Camden house had been just one of several sites used by the group, though it was the only one operating in a residential area, the others being remote rural properties, far from potential witnesses. For Officers Ramsey and Collins, the Camden house case represented the most significant investigation of their careers. What had begun as a routine call to a neighborhood nuisance had uncovered a sophisticated criminal operation that had exploited society's most vulnerable members. The thing that stays with me, Officer Ramsey later testified during the trial, is how they used the house's reputation against us. They knew we'd gotten dozens of false calls about that property over the years. They counted on us becoming complacent, treating each call as just another wild story about the creepy old house at the end of Willow Street. The Camden house was finally demolished in 2016 after serving as a gruesome crime scene for one of the most significant human trafficking cases in the state's history. The vacant lot where it once stood was eventually converted into a small memorial park dedicated to the victims of organ trafficking, both those recovered from the basement that November night and the unknown others who had passed through the house's doors. For the Millfield Police Department, the case fundamentally changed their approach to abandoned properties. A specialized unit was established to conduct regular inspections of vacant buildings, with thermal imaging equipment used to detect signs of occupation or unusual heat sources that might indicate human presence or equipment operation. The case has since become standard training material for police departments nationwide, particularly those in areas with high concentrations of abandoned properties. It serves as a stark reminder that behind the familiar urban legends and neighborhood ghost stories that surround decaying structures, real horrors sometimes lurk, and that routine calls should never be treated routinely. As Detective Ward summarized in the closing report, The Camden House case demonstrates how criminals can weaponize our assumptions and familiarity. They didn't choose that house despite its high visibility and history of police calls. They chose it because of these factors, correctly assuming that repeated false alarms would eventually dull our response. They turned the boy who cried wolf phenomenon into a shield for their operation, with devastating consequences for their victims. Today, a small plaque stands in the Memorial Park, bearing the names of those identified victims and the simple phrase that has become the unofficial motto of the Millfield Police Department. Even the 100th call might be the one that matters most. October 2009. Detective Marcus Reeves had been with the Oakdale Police Department for 11 years. Most of them spent investigating property crimes and burglaries in the quiet suburban community. His partner, Officer Elena Vasquez, was newer to the force, but had quickly earned a reputation for attention to detail that often revealed connections others missed. Neither officer expected that a routine follow-up call to the Oakdale Storage Solutions facility on the edge of town would lead to the most disturbing case of their careers. The call had come in 3 days earlier, the facility manager reporting that several units had been broken into overnight. It wasn't unusual. Storage facilities were common targets for thieves looking for easily pawnable items. The responding patrol officers had taken statements, photographed the damaged locks, and filed a standard report. What brought Reeves and Vasquez back to the facility was a pattern that Vasquez had noticed while reviewing recent theft reports. "This is the fourth break-in at this facility in 2 months," she pointed out as they drove to the scene. "But here's what's strange. In every case, the renters of the burglarized units couldn't identify anything missing." Reeves nodded thoughtfully. "Could be inexperienced thieves who got spooked and ran before taking anything." 4 times? Vasquez countered. "And always at the same facility? There are 6 other storage businesses in Oakdale, but none have reported similar break-ins." The Oakdale Storage Solutions facility sat on 5 acres at the end of an industrial access road, surrounded by a 10-foot chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. 200 individual units of varying sizes were arranged in rows of single-story buildings with metal roll-up doors. Security cameras covered the entrance gate and main office, but not the individual rows, a cost-saving measure that would later prove significant. The facility manager, Harold Weber, greeted the officers with visible relief. "Back again? I'm telling you, these break-ins are killing my business. Tenants are getting nervous." Weber walked them to the most recently targeted units, all located in the back row of the complex, furthest from the main road and office. 4 units side by side, each with damaged padlocks that had been cut with bolt cutters. "The weird thing is," Weber explained, "all these units belong to long-term customers who rarely visit them. Some haven't been here in over a year." Reeves examined one of the broken locks. "Do you keep records of when renters access their units?" Weber shook his head. "We're not that sophisticated. Customers have 24/7 access with their gate code, but we don't track individual unit visits." "And none of the 4 renters reported anything missing?" Vasquez confirmed, making notes. "That's right. One guy wasn't even sure what he had stored here anymore. Said it was mostly old furniture from his parents' house. Another one lives out of state now." What piqued Reeves's interest was a detail that hadn't made it into the initial report. If nothing was taken, how do you know the units were actually entered? Maybe the perpetrators were interrupted before they could get inside. Weber's expression shifted slightly. "Well, that's the thing. The units weren't just broken into. They were used." "Used?" Vasquez asked. "What do you mean?" Weber looked uncomfortable. "There were signs someone had been inside, moving things around. One customer said it looked like someone had cleared a space in the center of his unit, shifting boxes to the sides. Another found a folding chair that wasn't his set up in the middle of his storage space. Reeves and Vasquez exchanged glances. This wasn't typical burglar behavior. "We'd like to see those units," Reeves said. The first unit contained household goods, furniture wrapped in plastic, stacked boxes labeled kitchen and bedroom, typical items people store during moves or downsizing. But true to Weber's description, the boxes had been rearranged to create an open space in the center of the 10-15 unit. The second unit told a similar story. Outdoor equipment, holiday decorations, and camping gear had been methodically moved aside to clear the central area. A folding chair faced the back wall. "Has crime scene processed these units?" Reeves asked, careful not to touch anything. Weber shook his head. The patrol officers didn't think it was necessary since nothing was stolen. Vasquez was studying the concrete floor of the unit. "There's something here," she said, crouching down. Using her pen, she pointed to dark stains on the concrete, droplets in a spatter pattern. "Could be anything in a storage unit," Weber suggested. "Paint, oil." "I think we should get the crime scene unit out here," Reeves decided, his instincts now fully engaged. "And I'd like to see the security footage from the nights of the break-ins." Back in the facility office, Weber showed them the security system, a basic setup that recorded footage from 4 cameras, covering the front gate, the office entrance, and the perimeter fence on either side of the property. The footage was stored for 30 days before being overwritten. The night of the most recent break-in, 3 days earlier, showed nothing unusual until 1:47 a.m., when a dark panel van entered the facility using a valid gate code. The van had no visible license plate and drove to the far end of the complex, disappearing from camera view. "Whose code was used?" Vasquez asked. Weber checked the system. "It belongs to a tenant named Michael Lassiter, Unit C219. "One of the units that was broken into?" Reeves asked. "No," Weber replied, looking surprised. "His unit is on the opposite side of the facility. He rents one of our largest units and has been a customer for about 8 months. "We need to speak with Mr. Lassiter," Reeves said. "Good luck," Weber replied. "He's not easy to reach. Always pays 6 months in advance by money order. The phone number he provided rings to a voicemail that's always full." The investigation took a more urgent turn when the crime scene technicians confirmed that the stains Vasquez had spotted were human blood. DNA testing would take time, but the pattern suggested medium-velocity spatter, consistent with blunt force trauma. With probable cause established, Reeves obtained a warrant to search all 4 burglarized units more thoroughly. The results were disturbing. In each unit, luminol revealed blood evidence that had been carefully cleaned, but not completely removed. In one unit, technicians found a small piece of duct tape under a shelf, with human hair stuck to the adhesive. "We're not dealing with burglaries," Reeves told his lieutenant during a briefing. "Someone's using these storage units for something else entirely." The break in the case came when officers located Michael Lassiter's address through utility records. The small ranch house in a nearby town appeared unoccupied, with uncollected mail spilling from the mailbox and newspapers piled on the porch. A welfare check revealed that Lassiter hadn't been to work in over 2 weeks. His employer, a local printing company, reported that he had called in sick and then stopped responding to messages. With mounting concern, Reeves and Vasquez obtained a warrant to search Lassiter's storage unit at Oakdale Storage Solutions. What they found shifted the case from suspicious activity to a major criminal investigation. Unit C219 was immaculate compared to the cluttered spaces they'd examined earlier. The 15 by 20 space contained a desk with a laptop computer, a filing cabinet, and several plastic storage totes neatly labeled by date. Most disturbing was a collection of video equipment, cameras, tripods, and lighting stands set up as if for a production. The laptop was password protected, but the storage totes were not. Inside, officers found external hard drives, dozens of labeled USB drives, and financial records that would eventually reveal an operation that had been running for nearly 3 years. Digital forensics would later recover the contents of the laptop and storage devices, uncovering hundreds of videos documenting torture and abuse of kidnapped victims. The perpetrators, Lassiter and at least 2 accomplices, had been using the burglarized storage units as temporary studios for their recordings, selecting units based on tenants who rarely visited their spaces. The investigation revealed that Lassiter had been targeting homeless individuals and transients from bus stations in 3 surrounding counties, people unlikely to be immediately reported missing. The videos were being sold through dark web channels to clients worldwide, generating thousands of dollars monthly. They were using other people's storage units to minimize evidence at their own unit, Reeves explained in his testimony months later. They'd break in, conduct their activities, clean up afterward, and store all equipment and recordings in Lassiter's unit. If anything was ever discovered, the innocent unit renters would fall under suspicion first. The most chilling aspect of the case emerged when investigators analyzed the dates of the recordings against missing persons reports. At least 7 individuals documented in the videos had never been found, their cases classified as routine disappearances of transient individuals, until the connection was made. The storage facility's remote location, 24/7 access policy, and minimal security coverage had made it an ideal location for the operation. The criminals had calculated that storage unit renters who rarely visited their units might not notice subtle changes, and that damage to locks could be dismissed as failed burglary attempts when nothing appeared to be stolen. Michael Lassiter was eventually arrested at a bus station 2 states away, attempting to flee with altered identification. His 2 accomplices were identified through the videos and arrested within weeks. All 3 eventually received multiple life sentences for kidnapping, torture, murder, and related charges. For the Oakdale Police Department, the case transformed their approach to property crime investigations. What initially appeared to be simple break-ins with nothing stolen had concealed one of the most disturbing criminal enterprises the department had ever encountered. The storage facility case, as it became known in law enforcement circles, is now used in police training nationwide as an example of how seemingly minor property crimes can sometimes indicate more sinister activities, and how crucial it is to investigate patterns rather than isolated incidents. For Detective Reeves and Officer Vasquez, the case left lasting impacts on their careers and perspectives. Reeves would later specialize in crimes against vulnerable populations, establishing a dedicated unit focused on missing persons cases involving homeless and transient individuals. Vasquez was promoted to detective and became an instructor in property crime investigation at the State Police Academy. "What stays with me," Vasquez said in an interview years later, "is how these criminals exploited blind spots, not just in the physical security of the storage facility, but in our assumptions about what constitutes a significant crime. We nearly missed it because broken locks without theft didn't seem important enough to warrant deeper investigation." The Oakdale Storage Solutions facility was eventually sold and redeveloped into an office park. Few of the current businesses or their employees know the history of the property or the horrors that were once hidden behind its seemingly mundane storage unit doors. Today, a small plaque in the Oakdale Police Department honors the 7 identified victims of what the media dubbed the storage unit killings. It bears a simple inscription that has become a mantra for the department's investigators. Look beyond the obvious. The crime you see may not be the crime that was committed. March 2013. Deputy Caroline Mercer had been working the night shift in Pinewood County for 8 years. Her routine patrols took her through quiet rural roads in a quiet corner of the Midwest. Most nights were uneventful, responding to minor incidents, assisting stranded drivers, and doing occasional motel checks. One of the regular stops on her route was the Pine Rest Motel, an old roadside inn catering to truckers and travelers. It was an aging single-story building with 20 rooms and a flickering neon sign just off the interstate. Nothing ever seemed unusual about it. That changed on a rainy Tuesday at 3:17 a.m. when a guest in room 105 reported hearing strange noises from next door. The guest, a commercial truck driver, described hearing soft voices and something heavy moving on the floor. Deputy Mercer and her partner, Eric Donovan, decided to follow up. Upon arriving, the motel's night manager, Lloyd Harmon, greeted them with casual familiarity. He immediately guessed they were asking about room 103. "That'd be Mr. Cooper," he said. "He's a regular, comes through every few weeks. Sales rep, I think." According to Harmon, Mr. Cooper usually paid in cash and preferred to be left alone, always requesting the same room and declining housekeeping. Room 103 had its curtains drawn tight and an extra dark cloth pinned inside the window. A high-end black SUV was parked right outside, a bit extravagant for someone staying at a budget motel. When Mercer knocked, a calm, professionally dressed man in his 40s opened the door. He introduced himself as James Cooper and said he had been watching a loud movie. Something about his manner seemed overly rehearsed, too polished for someone who'd just been woken up at 3 a.m. The deputies asked to step inside, but Cooper hesitated. When pressed, he became defensive. During the conversation, Mercer noticed a sound coming from deeper in the room, a muffled noise that didn't quite match the story about a movie. When Cooper tried to close the door abruptly, Deputy Donovan blocked it, and the situation escalated quickly. Cooper attempted to escape through the bathroom window, but was apprehended in the parking lot. Inside the room, Mercer found a small locked closet. Inside was a young woman, dazed but alive. Authorities later confirmed she had been reported missing a few days earlier from a nearby town. She received immediate medical attention and fully recovered. The room itself contained various electronic devices and records that pointed to a broader pattern of suspicious activity. It turned out that James Cooper was an alias used by a man named Richard Allen Dawes, a former IT consultant who had created a false identity and traveled frequently, staying in motels under assumed names. Investigators discovered that Dawes had been operating in multiple states, targeting isolated areas and using false professional credentials to mask his movements. Through his background in tech, he maintained elaborate security around his devices and files, making it difficult to trace his actions. The discovery in room 103 led to a wider investigation and ultimately to multiple charges related to unlawful detainment, impersonation, and digital crimes. No serious injuries were reported in connection with the case, but the psychological impact on those involved was significant. Thanks to Deputy Mercer's attention to detail, the operation was stopped before more harm could be done. Her work was later cited in law enforcement training as an example of why even minor complaints should be taken seriously, especially in transient locations like motels and truck stops. The Pine Rest Motel was eventually shut down and demolished, and the case of room 103 became a teaching moment for law enforcement agencies across the country. Proof that quiet places can sometimes hide the most unexpected truths. December 2017. Officer Nathan Ellis had been working the overnight shift in the quiet suburb of Riverdale for nearly 6 years. The small police department's jurisdiction covered primarily residential neighborhoods, a modest downtown district, and a few miles of county road. Most nights consisted of routine patrols, occasional traffic stops, and responding to minor disturbances. It was the kind of place where serious crime was rare enough that officers joked about memorizing the names of all their repeat offenders, mostly public intoxication and petty theft. The department's detective division consisted of just 3 people, and they often found themselves assisting neighboring jurisdictions that had heavier caseloads. Officer Ellis had developed a ritual during his overnight shifts. At 2 a.m., he would tune his patrol car radio to WKRL, a local station that ran a call-in program called Night Confessions, hosted by a woman who called herself Maddie Knight. The show's premise was simple. Anonymous callers could share their secrets, confessions, and stories, while Maddie offered commentary or advice. It was usually harmless entertainment, relationship dramas, workplace complaints, and occasional bizarre stories that seemed too outlandish to be true. "It helps keep me awake," Ellis explained to his newer patrol partners when they questioned his late-night radio habits. "Plus, you'd be surprised what people admit to when they think nobody important is listening." On December 14, 2017, Ellis was halfway through his shift when Night Confessions took a turn that would ultimately lead to one of the most disturbing cases in Riverdale's history. The caller identified himself only as John, and his voice was notably calm and measured compared to the program's usual emotional confessors. "I'm calling because I think someone should know what's happening," John began. "There's a house in Riverdale on Oakmont Street where people go in but don't come out." Maddie Knight responded with her typical dramatic flair. "That sounds like the beginning of a horror movie, John. Care to elaborate?" "Number 723, John continued, ignoring her theatrics. "Blue house with white trim. They bring people there at night. I've counted 8 different visitors in the past month, always after midnight, always escorted in. But I've never seen these visitors leave." "Well, maybe they're leaving during the day when you're not watching," Maddie suggested, her voice carrying the slightly mocking tone she often used with callers who seemed to be spinning tales. "I've watched during the day too," John replied, his voice unwavering. "The only person who ever leaves is the homeowner. A man in his 50s, drives a dark green SUV, leaves every morning at 7:15, returns around 6 p.m. He lives alone, supposedly, but those visitors never come out." The conversation continued for a few more minutes, with the caller providing increasingly specific details about the house and the patterns he'd observed. Maddie eventually steered the conversation toward more entertainment-friendly territory, suggesting jokingly that perhaps the caller had discovered a suburban vampire or a secret cult. Officer Ellis might have dismissed the call as the ramblings of a bored insomniac or neighborhood busybody, except for one detail that caught his attention. 723 Oakmont Street was in his patrol area, and he recognized the description. The house belonged to Dr. Malcolm Reeves, a respected local physician who had lived in Riverdale for nearly 20 years. Ellis had actually spoken with Reeves a year earlier about a minor vandalism incident on his property. Ellis made a mental note to drive by the house during his patrol that night. There was likely nothing to the caller's story, but something about the methodical way the caller had presented his observations struck Ellis as unusual for the typically dramatic late-night radio program. At approximately 3:15 a.m., Ellis drove past 723 Oakmont Street. The house was dark except for a single light, visible in what appeared to be the basement. Nothing seemed outwardly suspicious. though Ellis noted that the property was well suited for privacy, set back from the street, surrounded by mature trees, with a detached garage connected to the house by a covered walkway. Ellis would have likely forgotten about the radio caller entirely, if not for what happened the following night. Once again, during night confessions, a caller identified himself as John and immediately referenced his call from the previous night. "I'm calling about the house on Oakmont again," John said, "because I saw something new tonight. The man brought someone in about an hour ago. Young woman, blonde, looked disoriented. He was holding her arm, guiding her. She stumbled on the front steps, and I heard something that made me certain something's wrong there. She said, 'Please, I won't tell anyone. Just let me go.' Then they went inside. Maddie Knight, clearly recognizing the potential liability of broadcasting accusations of criminal activity, tried to interrupt, but the caller continued. 'I'm not making this up. I have photographs. I have video recordings of people being brought into that house. Something bad is happening there, and no one is doing anything about it.' The call was abruptly terminated, with Maddie quickly pivoting to a disclaimer about the views of callers not representing the station before taking a commercial break. Officer Ellis immediately radioed dispatch to request a welfare check at 723 Oakmont. The dispatcher informed him that another patrol unit was closer and would respond. 15 minutes later, Ellis heard over the radio that officers had made contact with Dr. Reeves, who had been understandably disturbed at being woken after midnight, but had cooperated fully. The officers reported that Reeves was alone in the house, no signs of disturbance, and nothing suspicious observed. The incident was logged as unfounded, likely a prank call to the radio station. Ellis might have accepted this conclusion, if not for a peculiar interaction the next day. As his shift ended and he was leaving the station, he was approached in the parking lot by a woman who introduced herself as Madison Knight, the real identity of Maddie Knight from the radio show. "Officer Ellis, right? I hope you don't mind me approaching you like this," she said, her voice lacking the exaggerated persona she adopted on air. "My producer said you called the station asking about our caller from last night." Ellis confirmed that he had contacted the station earlier that day, inquiring whether they had any information about John that might help determine if he was a credible witness or a prankster. "They didn't tell me anything useful," Ellis added. "Said all calls are anonymous, and they don't track any information about callers." Madison glanced around the parking lot before responding. "That's the official policy, yes. But I wanted to tell you something off the record. That caller, John, he's contacted me directly several times, not through the show's line, but through my personal email. He's sent me photos of that house on Oakmont and video clips." She paused, visibly uncomfortable. "I thought it was just a listener getting too involved, maybe trying to create drama to get on the air. But last night, after he called again, he sent me something that, well, I think you should see it." She handed Ellis a USB drive. "I should have gone straight to the police station with this, I know. But the station's legal team advised against it. Said I could be liable if it's nothing. But I can't just do nothing." Ellis thanked her and promised to review the contents. What he found on the drive would serve as the catalyst for an investigation that eventually uncovered horrors hidden behind the respectable facade of 723 Oakmont Street. The USB drive contained several video files, all taken from what appeared to be a concealed position across the street from Dr. Reeves's house. The footage showed various individuals being escorted into the house late at night, just as John had described on the radio. Most disturbing was the most recent video, which clearly showed a young blonde woman being guided toward the house by Dr. Reeves. The audio was poor quality, but a woman's voice could be heard saying what sounded like "please" and "let me go." Ellis immediately reported his findings to Detective Sarah Montoya, the senior detective for the Riverdale Police Department. After reviewing the evidence, Montoya agreed that further investigation was warranted, though they needed to proceed carefully, given Dr. Reeves' standing in the community. The investigation began with discreet surveillance of the property and background research into Reeves' history. What they discovered painted a troubling picture that had somehow gone unnoticed for years. Dr. Malcolm Reeves was indeed a licensed physician, but he had surrendered his medical license in another state following allegations of inappropriate conduct with patients before moving to Riverdale and establishing himself as a medical consultant and researcher. He had no active practice, but maintained connections to several medical research facilities. Property records revealed that the house on Oakmont Street had undergone significant renovations shortly after Reeves purchased it, including extensive work on the basement, with permits describing the creation of climate-controlled storage rooms and the installation of enhanced electrical systems and soundproofing. Most significantly, Detective Montoya was able to identify the blonde woman from the video as Ella Barnes, a 24-year-old graduate student who had been reported missing 3 days earlier after failing to return from a campus research symposium where Dr. Reeves had been a guest speaker. With probable cause established, police obtained a search warrant for 723 Oakmont Street. What they discovered inside the seemingly ordinary suburban home would haunt everyone involved in the case for years to come. The basement of the house had been converted into a sophisticated laboratory and detention facility. 3 soundproofed rooms, secured with electronic locks, contained evidence of recently held captives, including personal items belonging to Ella Barnes and 2 other missing persons from neighboring counties. Document files and computer records revealed that Reeves had been conducting unauthorized research on unwilling subjects, focusing on experimental treatments related to neurological responses to trauma and fear. His academic credentials had given him access to pharmaceutical compounds that he had been using to subdue his victims. Dr. Reeves was not at home when the warrant was executed. He had left for work at his usual time that morning. He was apprehended later that day at a research facility where he maintained an office. When confronted with the evidence, he responded with a clinical detachment that investigators found as disturbing as the crimes themselves. "You don't understand the importance of the work," he told Detective Montoya during his initial interview. "Traditional research protocols are too limiting. Some questions can only be answered when subjects are experiencing genuine fear and desperation." The investigation eventually located 5 living victims who had been held in Reeves's basement laboratory for periods ranging from days to weeks before being released in remote locations, heavily drugged and with limited memories of their ordeals. Forensic evidence suggested there had been at least 3 others whose fates remained unknown. Ella Barnes was found alive, sedated and restrained in one of the basement rooms. She had been the subject of Reeves's experiments for 4 days and would require extensive therapy to recover from the psychological trauma, though she eventually became a key witness in the prosecution. As for John, the radio caller whose persistent reports had launched the investigation, his identity was eventually revealed as Jonathan Mercer, a retired security specialist who lived across the street from Reeves. Mercer had become suspicious after noticing patterns of unusual nighttime activity and had begun documenting his observations. When his initial reports to the non-emergency police line had been dismissed as a neighborhood dispute, he had turned to the radio program in hopes of drawing attention to the situation. "I knew how it would sound," Mercer explained later. "Crazy neighbors spinning conspiracy theories. But I knew what I was seeing wasn't right. When the police came that night and left so quickly, I realized I needed to create a record that couldn't be ignored." The case against Dr. Malcolm Reeves resulted in multiple convictions for kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, assault, and unauthorized medical procedures. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the Riverdale Police Department, the case prompted a reevaluation of how they responded to reports of suspicious activity, particularly when the subject was a respected community member. Officer Ellis, whose willingness to follow up on an unusual radio call had been instrumental in breaking the case, was later promoted to detective. "The thing that stays with me," Ellis remarked during a training session he now conducts for new officers, "is how normal everything looked from the outside. A respected doctor, a well-maintained home in a good neighborhood. Nothing that would make you look twice during a routine patrol. The horror was happening just below the surface, behind walls that were specifically designed to keep secrets." Madison Knight left her radio position shortly after the case concluded, unwilling to continue a program focused on anonymous confessions after experiencing the dark reality of what some people were truly hiding. In her final broadcast, she dedicated the show to those who speak up when something doesn't seem right, even when no one wants to listen. The house at 723 Oakmont Street remained empty for years after the conclusion of the case, unable to attract buyers despite significant price reductions. It was finally purchased by the city and demolished in 2021. A small community garden now occupies the site, with a discreet plaque honoring the survivors of what local residents still refer to simply as the Oakmont House. For many in Riverdale, the case serves as a sobering reminder that the most dangerous predators are often those who have mastered the art of blending in, hiding in plain sight behind credentials, respectability, and the natural human tendency to trust those who seem familiar. It also demonstrates the critical importance of taking seriously those who report behavior that seems out of place, even when the reports come through unconventional channels. As Jonathan Mercer noted in his testimony during Reeves's trial, evil doesn't announce itself. It doesn't wear a sign. Sometimes, the only way to spot it is to pay attention to the patterns, the small things that don't quite add up, the people who go in but don't come out. February 2014 was abnormally cold, even for Midvale, a small northern town where winters were already known for their severity. Officers Alex Donovan and Michael Reed had been partners for 3 years, primarily patrolling the southern district of the city, including Old Riverside Park, an extensive area with dense forest that became practically deserted during winter months. On the night of February 17th, the temperature had dropped to 15 degrees below zero. The patrol car's heater struggled against the bitter cold as Donovan and Reed made their routine drive through the park's winding roads. At 11:43 p.m., they were just about to complete their third and final pass through the area when Reed noticed something unusual through the passenger window. "Hold up," he said, pointing toward a clearing about 50 yards from the road. "There's a light over there." Donovan slowed the patrol car, squinting through the darkness. Sure enough, there was a faint glow visible among the trees, unusual for this part of the park, especially at this hour and in this weather. "Probably kids," Donovan suggested, though his tone betrayed doubt. Teenagers occasionally used the park's remote areas for drinking or drug use, but rarely in the dead of winter. "Let's check it out," Reed replied, already reaching for his heavy-duty flashlight. The officers radioed their position to dispatch, noting they were investigating a possible unauthorized presence in the park. With the car safely parked on the service road, they began trudging through the snow, their boots crunching on the frozen surface with each step. As they approached the light source, they could see it was a battery-powered lantern placed on the ground near what appeared to be a freshly disturbed area of snow. about 8 feet in diameter. The snow had been cleared down to the frozen soil beneath. "What the hell?" Donovan muttered, surveying the scene. Beside the cleared area sat a duffel bag and what looked like garden tools, a spade and a pickaxe. Reed approached the duffel bag cautiously, using his flashlight to illuminate the contents after carefully unzipping it. Inside were several plastic bags, duct tape, a box of disposable gloves, and a bottle of bleach. The two officers exchanged glances, both immediately recognizing these as potential crime scene materials. "Someone's digging in frozen ground in the middle of the night," Donovan said quietly, "and brought cleanup supplies." Reed nodded grimly. "Either they're burying something or digging something up," Donovan finished. The officers conducted a quick perimeter search, finding a set of footprints leading deeper into the wooded area. The tracks were fresh, suggesting whoever had been here had fled when they heard the patrol car approaching. Donovan radioed dispatch again, requesting backup and crime scene investigators. "Possible gravesite located in the southeast section of Riverside Park," he reported. "No suspects present, but evidence of recent activity." While waiting for backup, the officers secured the scene and continued to examine the area without disturbing potential evidence. Reed's flashlight beam caught something partially hidden under a nearby shrub, a plastic tarp, carefully folded, but with visible dark stains. "Alex," he called softly, "you need to see this." Before Donovan could respond, both officers froze at the sound of a branch snapping somewhere in the darkness beyond their flashlight beams. They immediately drew their weapons, positioning themselves with their backs to each other. "Police, identify yourself," Donovan called out, his voice echoing through the silent trees. No response came, but the officers could sense movement in the tree line approximately 30 yards away. Reed directed his flashlight toward the area, briefly illuminating a figure before it disappeared behind a large oak. "Police, stop where you are," Reed shouted, but the figure was already moving away, deeper into the woods. The officers faced a critical decision. Department protocol advised waiting for backup when confronting an unknown situation like this, especially in a location with limited visibility and difficult terrain. But whoever was fleeing might be responsible for what appeared to be preparations for concealing evidence of a serious crime. "I'll pursue," Reed said decisively. "You stay with the scene until backup arrives." "Mike, wait," Donovan began, but Reed was already moving, following the fleeing figure's tracks in the snow. Donovan radioed dispatch again, updating them on the developing situation and requesting immediate additional units. He could hear Reed crashing through the underbrush, occasionally calling out commands to stop. Then, suddenly, silence. "Mike?" Donovan called out, listening intently. No response came. Faced with the potential danger to his partner, Donovan made the decision to follow. He moved carefully along the tracks Reed had left, weapon drawn, calling Reed's name every few seconds. After approximately 60 yards, the trail led to a small ravine where Reed's footprints abruptly ended at the edge. Donovan's flashlight revealed Reed lying at the bottom of the ravine, about 15 feet below, motionless. "Officer down," he immediately radioed. "Southeast section of Riverside Park. Officer down in ravine." Making his way carefully down the steep slope, Donovan reached his partner, who was unconscious but breathing. Reed had apparently fallen while pursuing the suspect, striking his head on one of the many rocks that protruded through the snow. As Donovan administered first aid, he became acutely aware of his vulnerable position. The ravine created a natural trap, with steep sides limiting escape routes. Worse, he could no longer see the surrounding forest clearly, as the high embankments blocked his line of sight. The sound came from above and behind him, a soft footfall on snow. Donovan spun around, raising his weapon and flashlight simultaneously. The beam illuminated a man standing at the ravine's edge, dressed entirely in black, wearing a knit cap and leather gloves. Most disturbing was the pickaxe gripped in his right hand, the same tool from the cleared area. "Drop the weapon. On the ground now," Donovan commanded, aiming his service pistol at the figure. The man remained motionless for several seconds, as if calculating his options. Then, with surprising speed, he turned and disappeared from view. Donovan faced an impossible choice: pursue the suspect alone or remain with his injured partner. Professional duty warred with personal loyalty. In the end, there was no real choice at all. He couldn't leave Reed unconscious and exposed to both the elements and a potential return of the armed suspect. For the next 11 minutes, Donovan maintained a defensive position over his partner, constantly scanning the ravine's edges for any sign of the suspect's return. When backup finally arrived, they found Donovan shivering violently, his uniform jacket placed over Reed's unconscious form for additional warmth. Reed was evacuated to Midvale General Hospital, where he was treated for a severe concussion and hypothermia. He would eventually recover fully, though the events of that night would haunt him for years to come. The crime scene unit's investigation of the cleared area revealed what Donovan and Reed had initially suspected. It was indeed a grave site. Ground-penetrating radar identified an anomaly approximately 4 feet below the surface. When carefully excavated over the next 2 days, investigators discovered human remains wrapped in plastic sheeting and bound with duct tape, materials matching those found in the abandoned duffel bag. The victim was identified as Caroline Weber, a 26-year-old graduate student who had been reported missing 3 months earlier. The medical examiner determined she had been strangled before being buried in the remote section of the park. The man Donovan had encountered was identified 2 weeks later through DNA evidence left on the tools and duffel bag. James Mercer, 41, had a history of stalking allegations, but no violent convictions. When police attempted to apprehend him at his residence, Mercer committed suicide rather than face arrest. Further investigation of Mercer's property revealed evidence connecting him to 2 other missing persons cases in neighboring counties. Notebooks detailed his obsession with Caroline Weber, whom he had apparently targeted after seeing her jogging in Riverside Park. Most disturbing was the revelation of why Mercer had returned to the gravesite that February night. According to entries in his journal, he regularly visited the location and had become concerned that erosion from winter storms might expose his crime. He had planned to relocate the remains to a more secure location, never expecting a patrol unit to enter that section of the park so late on a bitterly cold night. For the Midvale Police Department, the case led to significant changes in patrol protocols, particularly regarding officer safety when investigating suspicious activity in isolated locations. The Riverside procedure, as it came to be known, mandated minimum 3 officer responses to any similar situations. Officer Donovan received a commendation for his actions that night, though he consistently maintained he had simply done what any officer would do for their partner. The experience cemented his reputation within the department, eventually leading to his promotion to detective. Reed returned to active duty after 6 weeks of recovery, but requested a transfer to day shift patrol. The psychological impact of the incident, particularly the knowledge that he had been completely vulnerable while unconscious in that ravine, left lasting effects. "I still dream about it," Reed confided to the department psychologist during a follow-up evaluation. "Not about falling or being injured. I dream about what might have happened if Alex had chosen to pursue Mercer instead of staying with me. About being alone in that ravine, unable to defend myself, while Mercer returned to ensure there were no witnesses. The case remains a sobering reminder to Midvale's police force of how routine patrol duties can suddenly transform into life or death situations. The section of Riverside Park where Caroline Weber was found has since been developed into a memorial garden, providing a peaceful place of reflection that belies the horror once hidden beneath its soil. As for Officers Donovan and Reed, though they no longer work the same shift, they maintain the profound bond that only comes from facing mortality together. During department gatherings, they're often seen sharing quiet conversations, marked by the unspoken understanding of what transpired during what they refer to simply as the last patrol, the final time they would ride together as partners, and the night that changed both their lives forever. For newer officers in the department, the case serves as both a warning and an instructional tool. As Sergeant Donovan now tells recruits during training, the most dangerous situations often begin with something small, a light that shouldn't be there, a sound that doesn't fit. Trust your instincts, follow procedure, and never forget that your partner's life may depend on the decisions you make in a split second.